Hey, tonight we crack open the shuttered window of a Victorian sitting room. There's a storm pressing at the glass. The wallpaper is yellowing with age, and a lace doily trembles on the parlor table. A single candle flickers beneath the glass dome, throwing long warping shadows on the patterned rug. You can almost smell the soot, the starch in the linen, and the faint trace of something sweeter. Lavender, water, maybe, or something meant to cover up the scent of decay. The air in here doesn't just feel old, it feels crowded, like someone else is still sitting beside you. Don't look behind you just yet. This isn't the kind of ghost story where the bumps in the night stay safely on the page. No, the Victorians had a knack for wrapping real terror in fiction's velvet glove. The whisper of silk skirts might not come from a phantom but from the repressed desires, abandoned children, and lost voices echoing down the corridors of society's expectations. You probably won't survive this with your skepticism intact, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far this midnight society spreads. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the parlor as the fire dies low. A book lies open on the side table, bound in deep burgundy leather, its gilt lettering worn away by fingers long dead. You settle into the stiff chair, its horsehair stuffing creaking under your weight, and start to read. Except you're not alone. The Victorians didn't just read ghost stories, they lived them. In the flicker of candlelight, you imagine the hushed gasps of a salon audience, crinolines rustling as a woman begins to read aloud. Her voice trembles, not from fear of the phantom in the story, but from the knowledge that her own fate might end up just as chilling, because the ghosts in these tales weren't just the dead, they were the silenced, the trapped, the punished. It starts with the simplest of details. The setting: drawing rooms lit by gas lamps, long corridors with nothing but your own footsteps for company, locked doors with keys long lost. The Victorians mastered domestic horror because the home, for many, was a haunted house. Guilt hung in the drapes. Regret clung to the wallpaper. Even the architecture conspired against the soul. Staircases too steep, ceilings too low, bedrooms designed for silence rather than comfort. And then there's the pacing. You notice it, how everything in these stories unfolds slowly. Not just stylistic flair, it's repression in narrative form. Women couldn't scream, so they fainted. Children didn't rebel, so they spoke to invisible friends. Men didn't admit mistakes, so they drank too much and died suddenly of a chill. Every detail tells you what's not being said. Take one of the most popular Victorian ghost stories, The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. It's a tale of a spectral child trapped in the snow, endlessly pounding at the window, trying to be let in. On the surface, it's gothic perfection. But look again. A mother punished for defying her family, a daughter left to die in the cold, and a house that never lets the past go. Historians still argue whether Gaskell meant it as feminist critique or moral parable, but to anyone paying attention, the ghost isn't the frightening part, it's the silence of the adults who let it happen. One mainstream historical fact here: ghost stories were a fixture of Victorian magazines' household words all the year round, and countless penny dreadfuls made spectral fiction a fireside ritual. But these weren't campfire tales. They were coded language. Women couldn't write openly about abuse or depression. but they could write about haunted attics, cold nurseries, and voices calling from locked basements. Here's a fringe tidbit you won't see in school books. Some aristocratic households kept a morning room permanently furnished just in case death came unannounced. Black crepe was folded in drawers. Mourning brooches made with real human hair were passed down like heirlooms. The dead weren't gone. They were waiting, and they weren't always welcome. You feel the mood in the room shift. The floor creaks, but you haven't moved. A draft runs across your ankles, though the window is latched. It's not fear, exactly, that you feel. It's recognition. The realization that for the Victorians, the line between fiction and memory was razor thin. Every ghost was a stand-in for something more dangerous. A shameful pregnancy, a mad relative, an act of violence hushed up with a funeral veil. Tonight, you'll meet all of them. But first, let your eyes adjust to the candlelight. Let the hush settle in. The ghosts in these pages don't shriek, they whisper. And if you listen closely, they might just tell you the truth the living weren't allowed to say. The wind outside whistles through the keyhole, low and insistent, like someone breathing too close. You draw the shawl tighter around your shoulders, even though it's not cold. It's the kind of instinctive chill that comes when someone walks over your grave, or maybe when you step across theirs. Tonight's tale continues with a girl, a real one, not a ghost. You wouldn't think she belongs in a horror story. She wears a tidy pinafore, recites her French verbs with trembling lips, and sits ramrod, straight in a her-backed chair. But her name is whispered down school corridors, even now, Constance Kent. You've heard of her, maybe. Or maybe you haven't. That's part of the trick. In 1860, 5-year-old Francis Saville Kent was found brutally murdered at Road Hill House. His tiny body was stuffed into a privy, throat slashed with something sharp and personal, a household of secrets unraveled under the gaslights, and the culprit. According to police, it was his 16-year-old half-sister, Constance. Now, pause there. You're in a gaslit room, and the governess just dropped her needlework. A girl did it. A well-bred girl. That wasn't just shocking, it was practically impossible. Girls like Constance were supposed to be pure, passive, decorative. So what do you do when one steps out of her scripted role and commits something unspeakable? Easy. You turn her into a ghost. Not literally, of course, but socially, spiritually. You erase her. They buried her beneath layers of institutional silence, sent her off to prison, then cloistered her in religious service in Australia. She lived to be a very old woman, quietly teaching children, never speaking of the boy in the privy. And so, she became the kind of shadow Victorian ghost stories: love, female, tragic, punished, still here, still watching. This is where you start to understand how truth and fiction blurred in the Victorian mind. When a woman did something monstrous, society couldn't accept it, so they turned her into something else: a spectre, a madwoman, a warning. Fiction became the fog through which real horrors were half seen, ever fully faced. And just like that, the haunted house becomes a metaphor for a haunted society. You picture Road Hill House, heavy curtains drawn against the morning, maids tiptoeing past closed doors, a governess with red eyes and secrets under her nails. In this house, silence is thicker than the dust. The true ghost isn't the boy, it's the guilt, the shame, the way the whole family tiptoed around the memory for decades. Here's your historical fact. The Road Hill case gripped the Victorian public like a fever. It inspired Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone and contributed to the rise of detective fiction as a genre. Inspector Witcher, the real-life detective on the case, was mocked in the press for suspecting a respectable young lady. The scandal wasn't just about murder, it was about who was capable of it. Now for your strange, delightful fringe tidbit. Constance's confession came years later, in a private moment with an Anglican priest. He kept her secret for 5 years, citing the sacredness of confession. You can almost hear the clergy whispering among themselves. What is more frightening, sin, or a girl who claims it for herself? Historians still argue whether Constance really did it. Some believe she took the blame for someone else, her father, her older brother, even the maid. But her story isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about how society couldn't cope with the idea of a girl being anything other than good. So they exiled her into the margins, into whispers, into the shadows, and there she joined the others. You see now how Victorian ghost stories start to pile up with the weight of unspoken truths. Each flickering figure in the hallway might be a version of Constance unseen, unheard, never forgiven. The ghost is the consequence society can't admit. Walking the corridors because no one dared to confront her when she was alive. You stand at the top of the stairs. Below you, the house groans with the weight of memory. You know better than to light a candle, because what you'll see might not be the dead. It might be something far worse, the living pretending not to know what they did. And so the ghost stories flourish. Because when reality is too ugly to look at directly, fiction steps in to carry the weight. A woman who dares speak her mind becomes possessed. A child who rebels must be under the influence of spirits. A household falling apart blames the cold spot in the nursery, not the lies at the dinner table. It's safer that way, but you've seen the glint in Constance's eyes. You know the ghost stories are mask sand behind them. The faces are heartbreakingly human. You're in a drawing room now, all velvet settees and low-burning lamps. The fire hisses behind the grate like it knows something you don't. And above the mantel, framed in gilded oak, is a painted portrait of a girl who doesn't blink. You stare longer than you meant to. Her expression changes, doesn't it? This is the world of the séance, where the dead speak and the living lean in. Victorian society, with all its starch and strict etiquette, had an unquenchable hunger for the otherworldly, and that hunger made room for the weird, the wondrous, and the wickedly theatrical. You might imagine prim ladies sipping tea but behind drawn curtains. Many were busy conjuring the dead. Literally, welcome to the golden age of spiritualism. It's 1853. You're at a fashionable London townhouse, where guests whisper behind lace fans and fingers tremble above planchettes. Everyone's waiting for the table to rise, for the candle to flicker, for the veil to lift. And at the center, a young woman in white eyes closed, face serene, the medium. She's not just a novelty act. She's the star of the evening. A portal. Here's your historical fact. Victorian spiritualism surged after the 1848 Fox Sisters phenomenon in New York. But it found fertile ground in grief-stricken Britain, especially during and after the Crimean War. Families, especially women, who'd lost husbands and sons in far-off battles, were desperate to believe that death wasn't the end. But let's get weirder. Many mediums were teenage girls, young, nervous, often poor. Their gifts sometimes arrived after trauma, illness, or intense isolation. They were seen as vessels passive enough for spirits to occupy, empty enough to become channels. It was the only socially acceptable way for a Victorian girl to speak in a man's voice, shout in a trance, demand attention. You smirk, possession as empowerment. That's one way around patriarchy. One girl, Florence Cook, became the darling of London séances, when she summoned a full-bodied apparition named Katie King. The ghost walked. She whispered. She smiled and vanished. But during one séance, a male sitter grabbed Katie and found Florence underneath the veil. Scandal, mockery, applause. Florence became infamous. Historians still argue whether Florence was a fraud or a victim of overzealous believers. Was she manipulating the crowd, or was she manipulated by the men who staged and sponsored her? Either way, the lesson is the same. When a girl speaks too loudly, society insists she must be channeling someone else, even better if that someone is dead. Séances became the performance art of repression. You couldn't talk politics at the dinner table, but you could whisper with ghosts in the drawing room. The spirit world became a loophole. Women could speak so long as they weren't speaking as themselves. And while the gas lamps flickered and the tables danced, something deeper stirred. You begin to understand ghost stories weren't just entertainment. They were expressions of grief, of loss, of things left unsaid. In a society where emotion was suspect and silence a virtue, the séance was a back door into honesty. Now, for your fringe tidbit. In 1874, a 13-year-old girl in Yorkshire claimed she was haunted by the spirit of a nun who wanted to confess her 300-year-old sins. The case became so famous, it drew spiritualists and skeptics from across England, eventually inspired several plays and novels. The girl later admitted to faking it, but by then the ghost had already stepped into legend. You think about that girl, now how many eyes were on her? How many people believed her, not because they trusted her, but because she gave them what they wanted: mystery, drama, closure, and maybe, just maybe, a thrill they couldn't admit craving, because pleasure was dangerous. Too dangerous for a Victorian girl to want openly. But the séance was safe. It was divine. It was somehow allowed. You glance around the room. Shadows stretch toward you. Maybe it's the candle, or maybe the dead are listening to. One of them leans in and whispers, not with words, but with memory. The girls who found a voice only when pretending not to have one. The women who shook and wept entranced because no one listened when they were calm. The stiff portraits above you weren't always so still. Once they moved. Once they breathed. Now you hear a table creak. A piano string plucks itself in the next room. The glass of the window fogs faintly, with breath that isn't yours. You're not alone anymore. You never were. The room fades and shifts again. Velvet and gilt are replaced by stone and soot. You're standing at the foot of a narrow staircase, spiral and steep, with a draught curling up from below like cold fingers. Your hand slides along the banister. Damp hand you descend. Welcome to the English boarding school. It smells like chalk, ink, and secrets, the kind no one dares write in a diary. This is the realm where stories were whispered under quilts, where girls dared each other to sneak into locked wings, and where ghost tales weren't just for thrills, they were currency. Survival, even. Tonight's lesson. The terrifying freedom of imagination. In the 19th century, all-girls schools boomed across Britain, meant to shape young minds and tame wayward instincts. These academies doubled as cages with book spines and busts of Milton. Yet behind every neat row of desks lurked the irrational, the ghost in the lavatory mirror, the nun in the attic, the girl who vanished from bed and left her shoes neatly by the hearth. That last one. You hear it all the time. Your historical fact. Victorian schools, especially for upper-middle-class girls, were often isolated in converted estates. cloistered away from cities. Many had no electricity, creaked with age, and were run by underpaid mistresses with a love of discipline and a fear of anything improper. A breeding ground for repression and unsurprisingly, ghosts. In these schools, girls were raised to be modest, obedient, and uncomfortably quiet. But in the hours after, lights out, their imaginations became unruly, and nothing spreads faster than a good haunting, especially if it lets you scream into a pillow with your friends and call it fear. There's a fringe detail for you. Some schools actively encouraged ghost stories within reason. It was thought to keep the girls occupied, provide moral lessons, don't wander alone or she'll find you, and even reinforce Christian virtue by painting the supernatural as a warning. But of course, it never stayed that simple. You can picture it now. 5 girls huddled beneath one blanket. One tells the story low voice, deliberate pauses, and the others flinch at every board creak. One girl always insists it's nonsense, until she wakes up with claw marks on her pillow. You wonder if those were real. But here's the twist, one you didn't expect. The more these girls shared ghost stories, the more they created a counter-reality. In it, girls weren't passive, they were hunted, yes, but also powerful. Some summoned the ghost, some were the ghost. Some girls claimed they could see things the others couldn't. And suddenly, that shy girl in the back row wasn't invisible anymore, she was haunted. Or gifted, or both. Historians still argue whether this imaginative fervor was a byproduct of educational repression or a hidden feminist outlet. But it's clear that ghost stories gave Victorian girls a voice when they had none. Fear was the door they could open without breaking rules. And let's not forget the infamous ghost walks. Some schools held them on purpose. A test of bravery, they said. Walk from the dormitory to the old bell tower and back, alone in the dark. You might return sobbing or giggling, or not at all. You're halfway down the corridor now. A draft curls around your ankles. The candle you didn't realize you were holding flutters against your knuckles. Ahead, a girl stands in a nightdress, hair down, barefoot. You try to speak, but she raises one finger to her lips. Then she turns and vanishes into the dark, no sound, no wait. You don't chase her. You don't need to. She was never real, and yet she always is. A composite of every girl who whispered rebellion under her breath, every girl who invented a ghost to explain her loneliness, every girl who found meaning in fear because fear, at least, paid attention. She's behind you now, just watching, just making sure you remember, because here's what no one tells you. Ghost stories were one of the only acceptable ways for girls to express deep feeling, grief, longing, rage, love, pleasure. Yes, that too. Not the overt kind, of course. But listen closely to their favorite stories and you'll hear it. A thrill, a rush, a forbidden tingle of sensation. Being chased, being chosen, being seen, even if only by a ghost. You pass a cracked mirror in the corridor and glance sideways, just to be sure nothing's there. But the candle flickers again, and somewhere in the dark, you hear a laugh, soft, girlish, defiant. The ghost stories weren't just fiction. Not then, not now. You're walking now through a gaslit alleyway, boots echoing on wet cobblestones, the faint sound of carriage wheels distant and smothered by fog. This is London, the teeming, breathing beast of it. And while your eyes scan for shadows lurking, in the mist, your ears tune to a different pulse. Gossip, the stories that flicker in boarding schools, are born again here, reshaped by adult mouths into something grittier, darker Victorian ghost stories for the masses. And unlike the tales whispered under blankets, these ones aren't only meant to scare, they're meant to sell. This is the birth of the penny dreadful, your historical fact. By the 1840s, serialized horror tales exploded in popularity among the literate working class. For a penny, readers could devour lurid tales with titles like The Ghost of the Vault or The Wandering Spectre of Camden Town. These weren't quaint morality tales, they were sensational, grotesque, and sometimes shockingly erotic. Not that they'd admit that part out loud. You step into a print shop near Fleet Street, shelves sag under the weight of pamphlets, each cover more ghastly than the last. One shows a girl in a nightdress fleeing a darkened manor. Another, a skeletal figure rising from a grave. The lines between horror and fantasy blur like ink in rain. Fringe detail. Some of the most popular ghost stories at the time were claimed to be true. Entire columns were dedicated to alleged hauntings, complete with sworn testimonies from trembling maids or grieving widows. These tales were laced with realism, not to verify them, but to invite readers to want them to be true. The ghosts became part of the city's breath. You duck into a tea shop where a small crowd gathers by the fire. An old man tells the tale of a pale woman who walks the embankment at dawn. They say she wears a blood-stained wedding gown. They say she whispers your name if you stand too close to the Thames. She's nonsense, of course. Probably, but even as the old man chuckles at his own story, a young woman in the back corner goes still. You can't help but notice she's not laughing, because for women, these stories hit differently. They weren't just cheap thrills. They were coded warnings, maps, sometimes even confessions. Take the tale of the bleeding bride, for example, a ghost who appears only to unfaithful husbands, or the grey widow who haunts the men who once mocked her grief. These weren't simply cautionary tales, they were vengeance, fantasies in lace and tulle. Historians still argue whether these feminine phantoms were empowering symbols or just recycled misogyny with a supernatural twist. But one thing's certain, they resonated deeply, especially for readers who knew what it meant to live at the mercy of men, law, and luck. That's why many ghost stories in this era carry a strange emotional duality. They're frightening, yes, but also comforting. The dead return not just to haunt but to speak, to warn, to be heard. You exit the shop and drift toward Whitechapel, where fog clinks heavier and the gaslight grows thin. Here, the line between fiction and reality has always been delicate. Every woman walking alone knows this. Suddenly, a church bell tolls. Somewhere, a door slams. And now you understand why these stories flourished. They made the invisible visible. Fear wasn't just personal, it was communal. Read aloud in kitchens, pub corners, or factory floors. Ghost stories created solidarity. You feel it now, that thrill behind your ribs, not quite fear, not quite joy. A kind of electricity. The same feeling women felt when they read a story about a ghost that cried in a nursery window because her baby had been taken from her, or one about a murdered maid who refused to let her body be buried until her master's guilt was named. These weren't tales pulled from nothing. They were rooted in the real dot. Behind every banshee's wail was a scream no one heard in life. Behind every haunted manor, a woman who never got to leave, and behind every shiver down your spine, maybe someone who once stood right where you are. Listening too closely, the fog presses closer. You swear you hear footsteps behind you, but when you turn, the alley is empty. The penny dreadful in your pocket feels heavier than paper, because you know now. These stories weren't just to pass the time. They were to pass truth, truth that couldn't be spoken aloud. Not in court, not in sermons, not in parlors, but in ghost stories. In those, the dead never had to stay silent. You keep moving, the alley thinning out as your boots touch down on slick cobbles edged with horse dung and old soot. Victorian London doesn't sleep, it just shifts shape. And tonight, it takes the form of a narrow boarding house, lit by one crooked gas lamp and the dull glow of a taper candle in the upstairs window. You're here for a séance. That S, right. Ghost stories didn't stay on the page. In the second half of the 19th century, they started performing. And it wasn't just crumbling actresses and fraudulent mediums chasing a trend. Spiritualism had taken hold, and it was tearing through middle-class parlors faster than tea trays and fan gossip. You enter the house quietly. A group is already seated in a circle, all laced cuffs and solemn faces. At the center, a young woman is sensitive. They whisper, closes her eyes, and places her hands palm up on the table. The room is dark, but the air feels charged, like something waiting to enter. Here's your historical fact. By the 1860s, séances were fashionable. Even Queen Victoria reportedly attended one after the death of Prince Albert. Society ladies who once organized charity teas were now hosting candlelit evenings to reach the other side. But don't be fooled. This wasn't some comforting spiritual hobby. For many women, especially unmarried or socially constrained ones, spiritualism was a weapon. It was one of the few realms where they could speak, command attention, and even lead a room. The veil between worlds. It offered power to those who had none in the waking one. The medium before you begins to tremble. The room stiffens, she speaks. In a voice not her own deep, gravelly, unearthly, it says a name. One of the women gasps. Her husband's dead 3 months. And just like that, the parlor becomes a stage where grief, guilt, and unresolved secrets play out. Cloaked in ghostly language, fringe detail. Many female mediums claim to be possessed by male spirits, granting them the strange freedom to lecture, swear, or issue commands, things they could never do in their own voices. Some even delivered entire theological treatises explaining the universe in ways that scandalized male clergy. Historians still argue whether these women were consciously subverting gender roles or simply channeling the cultural scripts they were raised with. Were they rebels or victims? Prophets or performers? Either way, the séance became a strange paradox, both deeply emotional and slyly theatrical. And ghost stories, once confined to bedtime whispers and cheap prints, now walked among velvet cushions and brandy glasses. You shift slightly in your chair. The candle flickers. The spirit has one more thing to say. A warning, it's vague, as always. Something about watching the cellar door and not trusting the man with the watch chain. But everyone nods, wide-eyed. The séance ends. A prayer is mumbled. The medium faints delicately into the arms of Ahoussemaid. No one speaks of fraud. Though you all saw the table lift. Instead, you gather your coat, slip outside, and step back into the city's strange thrum. In the lamplight, you notice a paper pasted to a wall. Madame Lavacy, you're dead today. You smile. It's a business, and it's a revolution. Because here's the quiet truth. In an age where women were told to be silent, chaste, and invisible, the ghost story and its live-action cousin, the séance, offered them voice, touch, even danger. You pass by another boarding house. A young woman stands at her window, watching you. She doesn't blink. You wave instinctively. She doesn't wave back. You keep walking, and now you start to wonder how many of these ghost stories were actually about ghosts, and how many were metaphors for the people trapped in their own lives, unable to leave, unable to speak, crying out through creaking floorboards and rattling teacups. There's an ache in that realization. You carry it with you, because if a spirit can speak through a teenage girl, then maybe the teenage girl was always speaking. You just weren't listening. You don't sleep much after the séance. How could you? The city's breath is too close. Its streets echo with the slow exhale of a world trying to forget what it's seen tonight. Your steps lead to something even stranger, the Cambridge Ghost Club, circa 1851. You're not headed into fog and flickering gaslight anymore, but polished wood, cigars, and the scent of brandy left out too long. The club is private, invitation only, and strictly male. It gathers in a room above a gentleman's tavern. The wallpaper's dark, the lighting minimal, and the leather armchairs have been sat in by generations of men who pretend not to believe in anything irrational until it creeps into their homes, whispers into their minds, and makes the chandelier swing for no reason. Tonight's guest speaker is a military man. Stiff collar, silver mustache, voice like gravel. He begins his tale, a desolate manor, an empty crib, a cold hand on his shoulder. You sit port as the room leans in. Here's your historical fact. The Ghost Club was real. Founded in the 1850s and revived in 1882. It attracted the great minds of the day: Charles Dickens, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and even William Crookes, the chemist who discovered thallium. Some were skeptics, many weren't. But here's the twist. This wasn't about campfire tales. These men thought they were doing science, Victorian. Ghost stories weren't confined to drawing rooms or printed penny dreadfuls. They were studied, dissected, measured, and the men doing it weren't eccentrics in tinfoil hats. They were some of the sharpest thinkers of their age. They gathered ghost reports like zoologists, sketching beetles. They built machines to detect a soul's exit. They believed quietly, and with increasing fear, that something unseen moved among them, immune to logic, immune to law, quirky detail. A man named Alfred Russel Wallace, who co-discovered natural selection with Darwin, became a committed spiritualist after attending séances. Yes, evolution's co-father spent his later years defending spirit photography. Historians still argue whether these clubs were early forms of psychological study or just high society escapism. Were they poking at grief with intellectual gloves, genuinely trying to build a bridge to the other side? Either way, the ghost became a riddle, and men who had conquered empires, who'd charted seas and shattered atoms, found themselves terrified by one thing they couldn't map: the soul. You glance around the room. One man wipes his brow. Another scribbles something down, soft weeping heard through locked doors. You're reminded that fear doesn't care how many degrees you hold. It moves into your house anyway, tiptoes down your halls, opens your closet when you're not looking. The soldier's story ends with a grave dug too shallow and a wife who hears her name, whispered every night at the same time. He looks embarrassed. Can't explain it, he says, but his hand shakes when he drinks. There's polite applause, and then another man stands. He says nothing, just opens a leather case and produces a photograph. In it, a family sits rigidly. For a portrait, except for the small blur in the corner, a girl, translucent, her eyes white. She had died 2 weeks before the sitting. The image was developed after her funeral. Someone swallows loudly. Another man crosses himself. And you realize how thin the line is between rationality and surrender. These were the empire's finest minds, and they were haunted by what? Maybe guilt, maybe memory, maybe nothing. But they kept gathering, and so do you, because slowly you're seeing it. The ghost story wasn't just a tale to frighten children. It was a mirror held up to the most powerful people in the world, forcing them to admit that they knew less than they claimed. You walk out past the tavern, head heavy with tobacco, smoke, and doubt. There's a man on the corner selling pamphlets. He hands you one without a word. Proof of the phantom. 6 cases from London's elite. You tuck it into your coat pocket and keep walking. And somewhere just behind your shoulder, you swear you hear it. A laugh, soft, feminine, echoing off stone. No. One's there. By now, you've started to understand. Victorian ghost stories were never really about ghosts. They were about control. Tonight, you step away from gentlemen's clubs and into a drawing room. Feminine, lace-lined, and softly scented, just the sort of room meant to soothe delicate nerves. But as you settle into the settee and glance around, you realize this isn't a place for rest. It's a room where something trembles underneath. Here sits Margaret Oliphant, ink-stained fingers tucked beneath a modest shawl. Her eyes are sharp, not the gaze of a woman cowed by fear, but one who knows exactly what fear can be made to do. You probably haven't heard of her, but in her day, Oliphant was one of the most prolific and respected writers in Britain. Dozens of novels, essays, and these ghost stories. Her most chilling, the library window where a young woman stares, day after day, at the spectral figure of a man writing endlessly in a window across the street, until it's revealed that the window isn't real. The building has no upper floor. The ghost is inside her. You settle deeper into the upholstery. This is where ghost stories begin to bend, becoming allegories for repression, for madness, for being seen but not heard. Historical fact time. Victorian society was obsessed with female hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for women who were anxious, depressed, or just too clever for their own good. You could be institutionalized for reading too much, grieving too long, or speaking out of turn. And so women wrote ghosts, not vampires, not werewolves, ghosts. Because ghosts don't shout. They haunt, they lurk, they knock once, softly, they don't demand freedom, they remind you what happens when you deny it. In this parlor, you realize how the genre became a lifeline. A form of protest camouflaged as entertainment. A place where Victorian women could speak their truths, safely encoded in mist and candlelight. Quirky tidbit. Some scholars argue that the woman in white ghost trope, the veiled, floating figure in so many tales, originated from mourning fashion. Widows were expected to wear black for years, sometimes life, but underneath, layers of white, like a shrouded soul made visible. Historians still argue whether the ghost story was a feminist tool or simply a gothic cliché. But here's what's certain: in a world where women couldn't vote, couldn't own property after marriage, and were often locked away for their emotions, they could still write, and readers listened, often nervously, often alone, by lamplight. You sip from a cup of weak tea and study Oliphant's face. She's tired. She buried her husband, then 5 of her children. She wrote through grief that would shatter most people. And she kept creating ghosts, not to terrify, but to speak. There's one story she tells about a woman who dies of heartbreak, only to return every year to walk the halls of her former home. No vengeance, no blood, just endless walking. The people in the house try to ignore her, but they hear the footsteps, always. Maybe that's the real fear, not a ghost in the attic or a shadow at the end of the hall, but the fear that a woman invisible, buried in layers of lace and expectation might one day rise and be seen. The fire in the hearth dies low. The room cools. Oliphant says nothing. She just offers you another manuscript. This one's titled The Secret Chamber, and it's about a woman who discovers that her perfect husband has bricked up a room in their home, hiding not a corpse, but something worse, her own past. You close the book and realize you're not in the drawing room anymore. You're in the story. You're inside a culture that told women to be quietened, then wondered why they whispered to the dead. Now you find yourself inside a dimly lit nursery. At first glance, its charming wooden rocking horse, velvet drapes, a dainty lamp throwing gold light over a porcelain-faced doll. But linger here, just a moment longer, and the charm begins to crack. There's dust on the cradle, cobwebs in the corners, and the doll, her eyes follow you a little too convincingly. This is where the ghosts of children live. Victorian ghost stories didn't shy away from the idea of haunted youth. In fact, they were obsessed with it. You see, in an age of rampant child mortality, a child's death wasn't just a tragedy, was an inevitability. 1 out of every 5 children in Victorian England didn't survive past the age of 5. Smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, they weren't horrors of fiction. They were nightly visitors, just like the ghosts. And so writers, both male and female, began to fill their stories with pale boys who wandered graveyards, little girls who whispered from windows, babies who cried through the floorboards of houses that had long since changed hands. You step softly toward a toy chest and open the lid. Inside, nestled among alphabet blocks and a cracked spinning top, lies a tattered storybook. The pages are worn thin. The story, The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. It begins in a snowy countryside with an orphaned girl sent to live in a mysterious mansion. A chilling wind howls through the halls. A phantom child sobs in the distance. Eventually, the girl learns that her aunt once bore an illegitimate daughter, child kept secret, shut out into the snow, who died alone on the moors. Now she returns, each winter, to knock on the frost-covered glass. This isn't just melodrama. This is guilt. This is generational shame wearing a child's face. Gaskell wasn't some fringe figure. She was close friends with Charles Dickens, but her ghost stories struck a different nerve. They didn't warn against criminality or greed. They mourned what society demanded women hide: unwed motherhood, grief, emotional depth, even love. Here comes your quirky tidbit. Victorian nurseries often included mourning dolls, made of wax and porcelain, dressed in the clothes of deceased children. They were posed for final photographs, then sometimes displayed in glass cases. A mixture of remembrance, art, and something deeply unsettling. Historians still argue whether these mourning dolls were acts of reverence or a macabre coping mechanism. But either way, they blurred the line between presence and absence, between the child that was and the ghost that lingered. And writers took that imagery and ran with it. You remember one story in particular, a boy who insists he sees his sister playing in the orchard, only she died months earlier. No one believes him, but the apples fall off the trees, still bitten. The swing still creaks at dusk, and in the end, when his mother finally follows him outside, there's no sign of the boy, just two sets of small footprints in the frost. Side by side, it's not about jump scares, it's about longing, because in the Victorian mind, ghosts didn't always mean danger. They meant unfinished business. And what could be more unfinished than a child's life cut short? You pass the doll again, and this time her head seems tilted just a touch more than before. There's something uncomfortable here, and it's not just supernatural, it's cultural. Children were expected to be obedient, docile, angelic, but these ghost stories gave them agency, gave them presence, even power. A weeping toddler in a hallway becomes a warning. A singing girl in an attic becomes a revelation. These weren't just scary stories, they were reminders that the emotions of children mattered, even if they were ignored in life. The wind rattles the window pane. A faint giggle echoes up the stairwell. You look down, and the spinning top you never touched is moving, slowly, in circles. You leave the nursery and shut the door behind you, softly, respectfully, as if not to wake what sleeps inside. And that's the haunting truth. In Victorian England, the ghosts of children weren't just imagined, they were remembered. The hallway grows narrower now. You trail your fingers along the wallpaper, faded roses and curling vines. There's something sticky beneath the surface, as if the house itself sweats secrets. The air smells faintly of lavender water and old ink. At the end of the corridor, you reach a library. Not the grand kind, mind you, no cathedral ceilings or rolling ladders. This is a personal study, small, private. The shelves are bowed with age, crammed with brittle volumes, many without titles on their spines. You step in. This is where the ghosts hide in books. Victorian England was, without exaggeration, obsessed with reading. Penny dreadfuls, serialized novels, gothic romances, and yes, ghost stories were devoured in parlors and bedrooms across every class. But in this cramped little room, you find something different. The writers who started to believe their own fiction. You pick up a worn copy of Catherine Crowe's The Night Side of Nature, collection of supernatural anecdotes presented not as tales of imagination, but true encounters. Crowe, a novelist turned spiritual enthusiast, insisted that ghosts were not only real, but measurable. She described them with the earnest detail of a scientist. How they smelled, the temperature of rooms, the way dogs reacted before a manifestation, and she wasn't alone. Charles Dickens, though often skeptical, recounted more than one unexplained encounter: cold spots, strange dreams, phantom footsteps. Even Florence Nightingale, saint of modern nursing, spoke openly about the spiritual visions she'd had while tending to dying soldiers. It was the age of industry, yes, but also the age of belief, and the library. It became the battleground. Historians still argue whether the boom in ghost literature was just escapism for a traumatized population, whether it reflected a sincere shift toward mysticism in the face of brutal modernity. Either way, the line blurred. You weren't just reading about ghosts. You were being warned by them. You thumb open another book, The Haunted and the Haunters by Edward Bulwer-Lytton. It's about a London townhouse plagued by malicious spirit walls that bleed, furniture that shatters, nightmares that twist the mind. But in the final twist, the haunting isn't caused by a ghost at all. It's by the psychic residue of evil acts, the trauma of a man who used hypnotism to destroy others, whose cruelty soaked into the house like rot. You pause. That idea that buildings could remember, that cruelty could outlive its source isn't just spooky, it's revolutionary. It's psychological horror before psychology had a name. Here's your quirky tidbit. Queen Victoria herself was fascinated by the occult. She reportedly held séances in the aftermath of Prince Albert's death, seeking comfort in the belief that he could speak through mediums. That's not tabloid gossip, it's part of the royal record. Even the most powerful woman in the empire couldn't resist the promise of one more conversation with the dead. You glance up at the shelves again. Some of these books are cracked wide, splayed like open wounds. One has a faint handprint on the cover. Another smells like pipe smoke. You're starting to feel watched, not malevolently, but with interest, as if someone, somewhere, wants you to keep reading. And maybe that's the point. Victorian ghost stories often feature a reader within the story. Someone who uncovers a hidden diary, deciphers a letter, or opens a forbidden manuscript. It's not just a narrative device, it's a mirror. You are the character now. You're holding the book, you're flipping the pages, and what you discover may follow you long after you close the cover. Remember the turn of the screw. A governess reads into her new job. Children under her care may not be communing with the dead, but the real haunting isn't the ghosts, it's her mind unraveling. Or is it? Scholars still debate whether Henry James meant the apparitions to be real or figments of repression and guilt. Either way, it's masterful, because what's scarier than a haunted house? A haunted mind. You crouch down to peer at the lowest shelf. There, between 2 volumes of dry sermons, you find a slim, handwritten journal. The leather binding is cracked. The initials ECR scrawled on the flap. You open it. The entries are dated 1874. They describe a woman's descent into sleeplessness, her dreams filled with a man who stands at the foot of her bed. She calls him the thin gentleman. She starts leaving out tea for him. Eventually, she writes, he speaks now. He says he was always in the house, even when I was a girl. The entries stop abruptly. The rest of the pages are blank, but they smell like lilacs. You don't know why. The fire and the great hisses. The shadows on the wall look like fingers. You put the journal back and rise. In the Victorian mind, ghosts didn't just knock at the door. They crept into the margins of your favorite book. They whispered between the lines. They watched you read, and just maybe, they still do. You step out of the library, and the hallway greets you like a lung that's held its breath too long. The carpet runner is worn thinner here, as if people law things pace this stretch more than any other. You sense it instantly. This was the part of the house that bore witness, that absorbed confessions not meant for daylight. At the end of this corridor is a door with 3 locks. You try the handle, UNLATCHED. It creaks open to reveal a bedroom Spartan, but not cold. A lace nightgown is folded neatly on the bed. The candle on the bedside table is stubby, as if burned down to the wick in a single desperate night. A worn doll sits on the windowsill, turned to face the wall. This was a girl's room, and this is where the ghosts get personal. The Victorians adored ghost stories, centered around children girls in particular. Innocence in peril. Little white dresses caught in graveyard winds. But more than anything, it was morning that haunted this space. You walk toward the wardrobe. A faint melody brushes your ears, something music box-like, off-key. You open the door. Hanging inside are 2 identical dresses, one clearly smaller than the other. And then, tucked in the corner, a black veil, child-sized. Here's your mainstream history fact. In Victorian England, infant and child mortality was painfully common. Illness, poor sanitation, and minimal medical knowledge meant that families often buried multiple children. Entire industries sprang up around mourning culture. Black crepe factories, hair jewelry, post-mortem photography. Yes, you heard that right. Families paid to have photos taken of their dead children, often posed to look alive, propped on chairs, eyes painted onto closed lids. Siblings asked to sit beside them, trying not to cry. The images weren't morbid at the time. They were love, captured before it slipped into forgetfulness. And so it makes sense, doesn't it, that ghost stories often began with the soft weeping of a girl alone in her bedroom. That the sound of skipping rope in an attic meant someone hadn't moved on. You glance at the doll again. Its head is cocked just a little too far to the side. Victorian authors knew this fear well. Charlotte Riddell, Amelia B. Edwards, Rhoda Broughton, they all penned stories of haunted nurseries, spectral playmates, and girls who warned the living of danger. These weren't just tropes, they were responses to personal grief. Many of these writers had lost siblings or children themselves. Here's your quirky tidbit. One popular ghost story of the era involves a girl haunted by her own imaginary friend, a spirit named Louisa, who lived behind the mirror. When the girl died of typhoid, her younger sister began speaking with Louisa. The family claimed Louisa warned them of fires, of bad suitors, even of a poisoning incident. Eventually, the mother started keeping a notebook titled Louisa's Messages. Scholars still debate whether this was early spiritualism, psychosis, or something in between. You pull the nightgown gently off the bed. Beneath it, you find a diary pressed flat as if hidden in haste. You open to the middle. I hear her again tonight. The entry reads, she asks for her hair ribbon. I told her we buried it with her. She says she knows. She says she saw you. Gently close the book. The sense in the room thickens, not threatening, but grieving. The kind of sadness that curls up in your throat and makes you swallow twice. You begin to notice something strange. The doll's limbs are jointed with little brass pins, not the cheap kind. The kind used by high-end doll makers. Why would a family bury that kind of doll in an attic? And then it clicks. This wasn't a place of memory. It was a place of containment. They locked this room up, kept it intact. Maybe even kept it fed. A cup of milk, a bedtime prayer, an extra place set at Christmas. Victorian households didn't just mourn their dead. They invited them to stay. This was the peak of parlor spiritualism. Middle-class families held séances in their dining rooms. Mothers tried to reach daughters. Children were taught to listen for knocks, for moving planchettes, for cold draughts as signs of love from beyond. Mediums made fortunes. Fraudsters and mystics alike traveled from home to home, offering glimpses of the afterlife for a shilling or two. You look down at the bed again. There's a slight indent in the pillow. You didn't notice it before, and the window, it's fogged, though the air is dry. You take a step back, unsure whether you've been intruding on grief, or something far less forgiving. Even now, scholars argue about whether these hauntings were psychological artifacts or community-sanctioned methods of coping. Were these just parents struggling to process the unthinkable? Or was there something about the time, the culture, the density of loss that allowed some thin door to stay ajar? You leave the room gently. You don't close the door. It seems disrespectful. The hallway sighs as you pass. There's another staircase, no narrower, winding the kind servants would use. You descend the boards, complaining beneath your feet. You don't look back, not at the doll, not at the veil. You carry with you the heaviness of those stories, the ones where the ghost isn't evil, isn't malevolent, just lonely, and waiting. You reach the bottom of the servants' staircase, and for the first time, the air feels like it's watching you. The walls here are lined, their plaster peeling in patches like ancient scabs. You move your hand along the cool surface, fingers, brushing a seam where the wallpaper ends and something older begins. It's darker here, not from the absence of windows, but from something more intentional. You've stumbled into the basement, and now the ghost stories get ritualistic. You round a corner and find yourself in what must have once been a kitchen coal-black stove, hanging iron pots, and a ceiling so low you feel the urge to duck, but something's wrong. The soot patterns don't line up, the ashtray is clean, and something has arranged 5 salt circles in a tidy crescent on the floor, and suddenly you're inside the part of the Victorian ghost story that people still whisper about, the ones that blend death with desire and grief with ritual, the ghost stories that stop being about spirits and start being about summoning. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Victorian era was obsessed with spiritualism. Following the rappings heard by the Fox sisters in 1848, séance exploded in popularity. Even Queen Victoria herself reportedly held private sittings to reach Prince Albert after his death. Mediums became fixtures in upper and middle-class homes, and belief in the afterlife shifted from something sacred to something interactive. But beneath that polite parlor exterior were the dark rooms, literal ones, special chambers hung with black velvet and thick curtains, the places where mediums conjured spirit hands, glowing ectoplasm, and voices that didn't belong to anyone present. The Victorians called them cabinet séances. You might call them terrifying, and many of those cabinet rooms were tucked away in basements, just like this. There's a shelf to your left, sagging under the weight of jars filled with strange, cloudy substances. Some are clearly pickled vegetables, others you're not so sure. One looks like hair, another like teeth. You don't linger. You step toward the far wall where a framed drawing hangs crookedly. It's a sketch of a woman's eyes, wide, mouth stitched shut, hands held palms up in offering. The paper is brittle with age, but the lines are sharp and cruel. Below it, a plaque reads only, Martha's Promise. A whisper rustles behind Yulo and wet, like someone trying to hum through water. You turn nothing, but then again, in Victorian ghost stories, it's never just nothing. It's something waiting to be asked. Here's your quirky tidbit. One underground spiritualist group in the 1870s believed that a woman named Martha Ridley, born in Kent and presumed mad, was the earthly gatekeeper to the spectral realm. Her followers claimed she didn't speak for 12 years after her son died in a mill accident. But during séances, her silence shattered. She chanted in a made-up tongue, writing automatic messages that many said predicted fires, deaths, and even Queen Victoria's declining health. They called her the mouth of the dead. No one knows where she was buried. Some say she wasn't. You move toward the cabinet tucked under the stairs. Its door sticks, and when it gives way, the scent hits you: paraffin wax and lavender oil. Inside are rows of old candles, some still wrapped in newspaper from 1891. There's also a chalkboard, cracked in half, and several slates scrawled with looping cursive. One reads, "I did not call them, they came anyway." The Victorians weren't just writing ghost stories, they were living inside systems of belief that made the supernatural feel procedural. There were instruction manuals, séance etiquette guides, even coded taps for talking to spirits efficiently. You light a candle, because of course you do, as its flame flickers to life. A new shape glows against the opposite wall, a doorway, bricked over, but with a faint chalk symbol still visible. A circle, intersected by 3 keys. Historians still debate what this symbol meant. Some link it to Freemasonry, others to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a real occult society that counted W.B. Yeats among its members. Some say it was a spirit seal, a binding meant to prevent passage between realms. Others, they think it was an invitation. You stare at the wall, the wax dripping hot onto your knuckles. A sound grows behind it, not pounding, not scratching, scraping like fingernails, trying to write a message. Through the stone, you blow out the candle. The darkness doesn't change. You try to remember every Victorian ghost story you've ever heard. They always had one thing in common. The rules. Don't speak to the spirit first. Don't ask questions you aren't prepared to have answered. And above all, don't break the circle. You glance down at your feet. You're standing in one. You leap back just in time. A gust of cold air slaps your face, extinguishing what little warmth remained. On the floor, the salt has been scattered as if something rose up from the center and spun outward. You don't wait. You move fast, retracing your steps through the kitchen, past the crooked drawing, up the servant staircase. Your breath shallow and sticky. The basement was never meant for the living. It was the part of the house, built not to store coal or preserves, but to contain ritual, to keep certain stories below the floorboards. You pause at the top of the stairs, heart pounding, fingers trembling. And you realize, just like the Victorians, you didn't go down there to hide. You went down to see if the stories were true, and like them, you're not entirely sure you want the answer. You slam the door behind you, the basement sealed like a chapter you're not ready to reread. But here's the thing about Victorian ghost stories. They never stay in the cellar. They follow you upstairs, because upstairs is where the morning happened. The front parlor is just ahead, its doors shut tight. For a second, you consider skipping it, but you've come this far, and in Victorian houses, this was the room of shadows and silence. You push the doors open, heavy curtains block out the sun. Dust motes dance in lazy spirals across the air. A black veil lies crumpled on a mahogany sideboard, and propped in the corner, too tall for its frame, is a life-size photograph of a young girl. You recognize her. It's the same child from the drawing, in the basement. Martha's promise, only now her mouth isn't stitched. It's just slightly parted, as if mid-breath. You swallow hard. This is a morning room, and not the polite kind where you drink tea with trembling relatives. This is the one they used before the body left the house. In Victorian times, death didn't belong to hospitals, it belonged to home. When someone died, they were cleaned, dressed, and displayed in the front parlor for up to 3 days, often in their finest clothes, children included. Flowers were arranged to mask the smell. Mirrors were covered to prevent souls from getting trapped. You spot one such mirror now swathed in black lace, its edges nailed with little bits of silver. One corner is peeled back just slightly. You don't look into it. Not yet. Here's your historical fact. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, Queen Victoria went into mourning and never really came out. For 40 years, She wore black and kept his rooms exactly as they were. Her extreme grief helped popularize a national mourning culture. Suddenly, there were rules. Widows were to wear black crepe for 2 years, with a strict timeline for moving into half-mourning greys and lilacs. There were even catalogues for mourning clothes and jewelry, often containing woven locks of the deceased's hair. You glance back at the girl's portrait. A brooch glints at her collar. It's made of braided hair. Now here's the offbeat tidbit. The Victorians didn't just photograph their dead. They posed them. Post-mortem photography was a booming business. Families unable to afford portraits in life often splurged for one in death. Bodies were propped upright with stands, eyes painted onto closed lids, cheeks tinted to simulate warmth. And if the siblings refused to sit still for the exposure, the dead child became the focal point, still and perfect, while the living blurred around her. You look again, the girl's photo is sharp, almost too sharp, and behind her, faint in the background, is something else, a silhouette, not a figure, not quite, more like a smudge of something waiting. You don't mention it out loud. Victorian ghost stories thrive on what's unspoken. You walk slowly now, around the edge of the parlor, past a velvet chaise with indentations where no one has sat in decades. There's a piano in the corner, dust on the keys, a single sheet of music still open. You trace the notes, dirge for the departed. You don't play it. Even the Victorians knew better than to awaken old melodies in rooms built for grief. But you do notice a ring of footprints in the dust, small, deliberate, leading away from the piano and circling back to the mirror. Now we come to the most debated question in Victorian folklore. Did they believe the dead could return? Historians still argue whether Victorians were sincere believers in ghosts or simply hungry for comfort amid high mortality rates. Infant death was common. War, disease, and childbirth were constant threats. Some scholars say ghost stories were a form of therapist scripts to process trauma. Others insist the belief was real, tangible, as real as the séance table and the whispered name in a darkened room. Either way, the parlor became a stage, and you're standing center. You finally peel back the edge of the mirror's veil and see nothing, no reflection, no, you just the parlor, empty behind glass, then a breath right at your neck. You whirl around, still nothing, but the veil flutters, slow and mocking, as if someone had just stepped back into the shadows. You blink and catch yourself whispering, "I see you." You wish you hadn't. A single note plinks from the piano. Your spine goes stiff. Another follows, a halting, hesitant scale, as if the keys remembered the dead girl's fingers, as if the room isn't finished telling its story. You race to the doorway, pausing only to glance once more at the portrait. Now she's smiling, or was she always? The memory won't cooperate. You slam the door, shut behind you, and you think about how the Victorians sat with the dead, lived with them, talked to them, photographed them, and told stories. Not to scare themselves, but to keep the dead in the room. Just a little longer, you realize you've become part of that tradition, a new chapter, and if someone snapped a picture right now, well, you'd probably look dead too. You don't head upstairs right away. Your legs carry you to the side hallway instead. Narrow and panelled with worn walnut, just wide enough for a maid to squeeze through with a tray of cold lamb. This is the servant's path, forgotten by design. But something about the silence here feels heavier, more compressed, like the walls themselves are holding secrets between their grain. You trail your fingers along the wood. Notch catches your nail. It's an old servant's bell, system-teeny brass domes mounted above the skirting board, each connected by thin rusted wires to a room upstairs. You watch the bells twitch, not ring, just twitch, as if the wires remember movement. This was the backbone of any respectable Victorian household, a discrete system for controlling invisible labor. Each bell labeled in spidery script: master bed, morning room, nursery, blue drawing room, and their sick. You pause. Victorian houses often included a space just for dying. Now you understand why the hallway smells faintly of lavender and carbolic soap, an attempt, maybe, to ward off the stench of infection or memory. Here's your historical fact. In the 19th century, tuberculosis, then called consumption, was the romantic disease of choice. Pale skin, flushed cheeks, fevered intensity. Poets swooned and painters lingered by the bedsides of their dying muses. Death was aestheticized. The sick room became a place of devotion. Air was filtered with herbs. Windows were opened for the soul's ascent, and family members were often encouraged to sit with the dying for hours, even days, to record final words, real or imagined. You're not surprised when you spot the door. It's half open. The hinges creak like a protest. As you nudge it wider, inside, a narrow bed, its mattress indented in the center like someone still sleeps there. A fireplace long gone cold. A half-drunk bottle of laudanum on the table. The glass stopper crusted with age. You take a cautious step inside. The wallpaper here peels, like old Scab's little paper flowers curling away from the damp. Your breath fogs slightly, not from cold, from something else. You realize the window is open, despite being nailed shut. You peer through the cracks, expecting fog or trees or gravestones, but the backyard is gone. Only blackness. Not night, not shadow, just the kind of empty that feels deep. You blink hard, rub your eyes. When you look again, it's just a garden, overgrown, ordinary. Maybe here single quotes as your fringe fact. Victorians, sometimes, posed healthy people in sick rooms to photograph them as if dying. It was a trend among middle-class families who wanted to appear refined, tragic, or spiritually elevated. In fact, some photographers offered deathbed settings complete with props and costuming. You could basically rent your way into a moment of poetic demise. There's a framed photo on the bedside table, a boyet, or 9 with thin limbs and a heavy blanket around his shoulders, eyes wide, too wide, and there, in the background, reflected faintly in the glass, a white blur that could be light, or breath, or hand. You reach to pick it up, but the moment your fingers touch the frame, the servant's bells behind you jingle. Just once, sharp, clear, every hair on your arm spikes. You whirl toward the hallway. Nothing but you hear footsteps, light, bare, coming from the staircase. You step out, heart thudding like a war drum. The sound fades. You follow anyway, past more framed portraits with blurred eyes and stiff poses. No expressions, just ghosts printed in sepia as you creep back toward the stairs. You think again about the blurred line between fiction and belief, between ghost stories as entertainment and as evidence. Historians still argue whether Victorian spiritualism was driven by religious longing, mass trauma, or simply economic exploitation. The Fox sisters in America, whose rapping ghosts launched a movement, later admitted they faked it, but their retraction never mattered. The idea had already taken root. You're halfway up the stairs when you notice something strange. The paintings on the wall. They're all of you, not literally, but every subject, man, woman, child, wears your expression, your pose. Some with mouths open, some with mouths sewn shut. And the stairs, they're longer than before. You climb and climb, but the landing never gets closer. You turn around, the first step has vanished. Your lungs constrict. You sit down, dizzy, gripping the balustrade. Victorian ghost stories were obsessed with liminal spaces, thresholds, doorways, the places where transformation happens, the moment before death, the space between sleep and wake. That hairline crack in reality, you realize you're caught in one, between what this house was and what it remembers, between a story and its consequences. And then, mercifully, your foot finds solid ground, the top landing, dim, dusty. You exhale, the photos are gone. Just floral wallpaper and a faint smell of starch. You take one cautious step toward the bedroom. Corridor, and behind you a bell rings again. But not from the hallway. This time from inside your pocket. You don't have pockets. And yet the jingle is unmistakable. You reach down and pull out a brass servant's bell, cold and gleaming as if just polished. Its label reads, You. You don't drop the bell. You should, but your fingers won't open. It's light, delicate, perfectly round and warm now, as though it's been held for a long time. The tag hanging from its stem flutters with your breath. You almost laugh. Almost. But the sound dies in your throat, because from somewhere deeper in the house, maybe above you, maybe behind you, hear a second bell ring, and then a third. The call system is alive. This isn't fiction anymore. It hasn't been for some time. You step forward, bell clenched in your fist like a charm against whatever this is. The corridor curves gently now, the wallpaper giving way to wooden paneling woke, this time with decorative inlays like eyes. The hallway swells with warmth. You feel it against your skin, though there's no radiator, no hearth. And then you hear it. Music, faint, warped. A music box. Notes dripping like candle wax through a locked door. The tune sounds familiar, no, more than familiar. Personal. It's the lullaby your grandmother hummed when you were sick. You haven't heard it in years, and yet here it is, echoing through the dark, unprompted, playing in a room you haven't reached yet. Welcome to the Victorian séance chamber. Yes, these were real things. Here's your historical fact. In upper class Victorian homes, it was fashionable, expected, even to host séances in a designated room. These weren't the cliched Halloween charades we picture now. They were often solemn, heavily ritualized affairs attended by intellectuals, scientists, clergymen. Some featured automatic writing, others focused on rapping sounds, ectoplasm, or full-bodied apparitions. Some families even kept séance journals, recording spirit messages and responses, like spiritual guest books. You stand before the door where the lullaby plays, carved into the lintel in scratchy cursive, parlor of memory, Victorian enough to be believable, eerie enough to give pause. You hesitate, then push the door open. The smell hits first dust, burnt lavender, old silk. Inside, the parlor is arranged in a perfect circle, 7 chairs, a round table at the center, draped in velvet, and in the middle of the table, the music box turns slowly, its ballerina arcing again and again with mechanical grace. Every chair holds a dull antique porcelain faces, tiny hands folded in their laps. They're dressed like different decades of womanhood. A schoolgirl with a pinafore, a nurse with a Red Cross armband, a bride in yellowed lace, a widow in black, a nun, a governess, a spinster with cracked lips and a judgmental expression. 7 archetypes, all watching the ballerina twirl, and all staring directly at you. Fringe tidbit. Some Victorian families believed that dolls could host spirits more safely than humans. There was a minor industry around spirit vessels, figurines designed to house the essence of the dead so they wouldn't roam freely. Some were even sold with names and preferred temperaments printed on little tags. You could pick your ghost like a pet. You don't sit, you should, but you don't instead. You step forward, watching the ballerina's face. It's smiling. No, it's smiling at you. You back away, suddenly aware that the chairs are no longer empty. The dolls remain. But behind each one now sits a woman, just barely visible, faces soft and shrouded, as though printed on fog. Their eyes glint, wet and mournful. They begin to whisper, not aloud, inside your chest. Write it down. One says, "Don't forget us," says another. You understand, somehow. These were the women whose stories were never published. The ones who saw too much, said too much, or said nothing at all and still vanished. Teachers who smelled gas in empty rooms. Maids who heard scratching beneath the nursery floor. Widows who dreamed their husbands standing at the foot of the bed. Eyes dripping seawater. Ghost stories. Yes, but never just fiction. You want to ask their names. You want to scream, but you don't. Instead, you pick up the music box and snap. The lid shut. The ballerina folds like a dying flower. The room exhales. When you step outside again, the corridor has changed. The walls are now hung with photographs, not paintings. Sepia, portraits of séances in progress. Hands clasped, eyes rolled back, gauze-like ectoplasm streaming from mouths. In one photo, a woman hovers inches above her chair, levitating. You recognize her. From earlier, she was one of the women in the séance room. Only now she looks solid and angry. You glance behind you, no one. You turn back, and the photo is gone. In its place, a mirror. Your own face staring back, pale and tired and very, very awake. Historians still argue whether these early ghost photographs were evidence of fraud or faith. Some were obvious fakes, double exposures, gauze draped from ceiling hooks. Others remain unexplained, even under modern analysis. What's more fascinating is how people responded. For the Victorians, these images proved something larger, that memory could linger, that absence had a shape, that stories, told often enough, become presence. You touch the mirror. Your reflection doesn't mimic you. Its lips move. Yours don't. It says, "They're waiting upstairs." You run. You don't look back. That's rule number 1, right? In every ghost story ever told, every shadowed folktale whispered from bedside to campfire, you never ever look back. Which of course means you're going to dot eventually. But for now, you focus on the stairs. They're narrower than you remember. The wooden steps curving upward like a spine, each tread creaking in anticipation. As you climb, the banister grows colder beneath your fingertips. Not ice cold, grave-cold. By the time you reach the landing, you realize something's changed. The air, it's thinner, drier, as if the attic above is sealed. Too tightly like a coffin just cracked open. A single door stands before you. white, panelled, unassuming, the kind of door you'd expect to find in any old house. But you're past trusting appearances. A brass key hangs from a nail beside it. Tag reads, "Room for the restless." Of course it does. Here's your mainstream. Historical fact. During the height of the Victorian mourning culture, some houses had literal mourning rooms. Not just spaces to sit and weep, but purpose-built parlors where the recently departed could be laid out for viewing, sometimes for days. The practice was part reverence, part necessity. Many people died at home, and embalming was expensive. These rooms were dark, solemn, and outfitted with clocks covered in black crepe. Mirrors turned to face the walls, and windows cracked just enough to let the spirit leave. But this door doesn't open onto a parlor. You turn the key, the lock clicks. Inside, a nursery, a perfectly preserved Victorian child's room. The wallpaper is hand-painted clouds and lambs, a sleepy moon. The rug is faded but soft, littered with tin soldiers and alphabet blocks. A cradle sits near the window, rocking slowly. No breeze. On the wall hangs a large framed needlepoint sampler. Children should be seen and not heard. The cradle creaks again, then stops. You cross the room slowly, footsteps swallowed by the thick rug. At the far end stands a wardrobe old oak with lion's paw feet, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, hanging in a row, are children's clothes, nightgowns mostly, and something more rigid, a miniature straitjacket, lovingly stitched with lace at the collar. Fringe tidbit. It's unsettling, but true Victorian doctors sometimes used restraint garments on children deemed unmanageable, especially girls. A diagnosis of hysteria could mean anything from anxiety to too much imagination. There are hospital records from the 1870s detailing the use of confinement, cribs, cold water therapy, and even lead-aligned isolation rooms for overstimulated minds. You flinch as something taps behind you. The cradle, now it's still again. But the doll within ceramic blonde, blue-eyed, has turned her head. Her tiny painted mouth is open just enough to whisper. You lean in. Nothing, then dash click, the wardrobe. Doors slam shut behind you. In the mirror above the dresser, your reflection is missing. You back away, breath shallow, and that's when you notice the photographs pinned along the slanted attic. Ceiling are dozens of cabinet cards, sepia portraits of children in stiff poses, eyes too wide, post-mortem images. Some have the telltale signs, propped limbs, painted pupils, but some seem to be watching you. There's one child whose photo recurs, a girl in a gingham dress, always in the background, out of focus, never the subject. And in the last photo, she's alone, standing in this very nursery, pointing toward you. You turn, she's there, or was now, it's just the air shifting again. The room settling like an exhale after holding its breath. You try the door, locked, of course, and then, behind you, the doll begins to hum, a lullaby, the same one you heard from the music box, and you remember it wasn't just your grandmother who sang it. It was the woman in the séance room, the one in the photograph, the one whose story keeps trying to break through. Historians still argue whether Victorian post-mortem photos were truly expressions of grief or something more exploitative. Some argue they were simple memorials, no different than keeping a lock of hair or a pressed flower. Others insist they were a final, desperate attempt to control death by posing with it, framing it, pretending, just for one last moment, that the family was whole. The girl's voice grows clearer now, layered beneath the hum of the doll, the creak of the cradle, the ticking of a long-dead clock. She's speaking through everything in the room. You don't get to forget. You bang on the door. Nothing, but then a faint rustle. A folded note slides from beneath the wardrobe. You open it with shaking hands. It reads, "She's in the walls." You stare, and then a voice no longer whispering, but ringing through the rafter says, "Come find her." The wallpaper begins to peel from the inside out. Behind it, a wall scrawled with names, each written in the same small, looping script. Dozens, hundreds, your own is near the bottom, fresh ink. You run your finger over the letters. They're wet, and then, for just a moment, behind the mirror you see her. The girl in gingham, smiling, then gone. There's no scream. You think there should be, but there isn't. Single quotes. Your breath doesn't even leave your body properly, as if something's pushing it back inside. You're frozen, suspended between flight and fight, and neither option works. Instead, you press your forehead lightly against the door. It's warm now, breathing back at you. Something has changed in this house, and it's watching you. A metallic clang echoes somewhere beyond the nursery, and the door handle cools beneath your fingers. Unlocks. You hesitate only a second before pulling it. Open. The hallway is longer now. The geometry makes no sense, stretches far beyond where the attic should end. Your footfalls echo louder than they should, as if the house is hollowed out, waiting. Floorboards ripple subtly beneath your steps, not unlike walking across a stage just before the curtain rises. You pass a window. The moon outside is red. Another illusion, or just part of the show. Mainstream historical fact: Victorian London once held massive public spectacles, called phantasmagorias, an early form of horror theatre that combined lantern projections, smoke machines, and actors in skeleton costumes to scare and delight the masses. These were often staged in abandoned churches or crypts. Attendees, mostly women, would scream and faint by design. But tucked within these performances was real belief. Ghosts weren't just stage tricks. They were newsworthy. And now you've ARRRIVEDA. Second door, black wood. Iron fittings, painted on its center. In curling calligraphy, the telling room. No handle, no handle. You press your palm to it. It swings open. This time, you do gasp. The room is enormous. Cathedral, high ceiling, candlelit. Alcoves. The walls are covered in handwritten letters. Thousands, maybe millions, pinned like ivy. Every square inch of the place has been inscribed with someone's story. And there, seated in a high-backed chair facing the fireplace, is the girl in gingham. She turns slowly, this time. You see her face clearly, pale, thoughtful, not hostile, just ancient, in that impossible way children of folklore can be. Eyes too big, mouth too calm. "You're late," she says. You swallow, unsure what to say. "Everyone comes here eventually," she continues, "but you took your time." She pats the floor beside her. You hesitate, then sit. The fire casts shadows that flicker in human shapes. "I used to be the secret," she says. "Now I'm the memory." You glance up at the letters. The handwriting isn't identical. Hundreds of voices, all speaking at once. What is this place? You ask. The room where the truth gets written down. She smiles. And burned. That part catches you. Burned. She nods toward the hearth. There, You now notice sits a metal basket overflowing with ash and fragments of paper. You pick one up carefully. The words are charred but legible. He said it wasn't real, but I still wake up screaming. Another, my mother saw her in the mirror first. Another, I was told it was just nerves. But the voices, you stop reading. You're a ghost, you whisper. Not really, she says. I'm what they tried to forget. Fringe tidbit. In the 1880s, British tabloids were flooded with letters from anonymous women reporting ghostly experiences that mirrored trauma. Some spiritualists even argued that recurring spectral sightings were the psychological remnants of repressed violence, making the apparition less an entity and more an echo. This theory became popular in fringe corners of the Society for Psychical Research. The girl stands and begins walking the perimeter of the room, brushing her fingers over the pinned pages. Every time someone was told their story didn't matter, it ended up here, where what happens when no one listens. You follow her to a corner of the room where a narrow desk holds a fountain pen, an inkwell, and a blank page. You need to write it down, she says, but I haven't seen the ending yet. That's not how this works. You pick up the pen. It feels heavier than expected, like it's filled with centuries. The ink is dark as oil. You write, I never meant to believe in ghosts, until the house believed in me. She nods, satisfied. Historians still argue whether the explosion of spiritualism in the Victorian age was fueled more by grief or by a desperate hunger for female voices in a silenced world. After all, it was women who most often became mediums, seers, and oracles. Women who finally had space to speak, even if only by claiming a voice that wasn't theirs, or was it? You finish your sentence. Ink dries instantly. The page lifts from the desk on its own and joins the others, fluttering upward to nest in an open gap between two candles. The girl in gingham smiles once more and begins to fade. Not like smoke, like memory. You try to hold her in place, call out, but her voice is already dissipating when you leave. Don't forget the stairs are different now, and she's gone. Only the letters remain. Thousands of pages telling thousands of half-remembered truths. You step back into the hall. The black door closes itself behind you, and now there's no staircase, just a ladder descending into darkness. You glance behind, no other choice. You begin the climb down. You descend the ladder slowly, each rung a little colder than the last. No creak, no echo, just your breath, shallow and rhythmic, and that rising pressure in your ears like you're going underwater. The air thickens with something metallic. Your hand slips slightly on the iron rails, damp with ... moisture. Condensation. You don't want to guess. You count the steps. 15, 23, 30-6. Then your foot touches stone. You've arrived. This isn't the house anymore. This is something beneath the house. A circular chamber stretches out before you, ancient and damp, carved entirely of dark limestone. Moss clings to the walls in faint green swirls, and the air pulses faintly, like the chamber is breathing. In the center stands a pedestal with an object on it. You approach. It's a Victorian mourning locket, intricately wrought in jet and gold, its clasp shaped like a weeping eye. You flip it open. Inside, instead of a photo, is a lock of human hair and a name carved into mother-of-pearl. You read it aloud. The name sounds familiar, though you've never seen it before. A low groan rumbles through the floor beneath your feet. Mainstream. Historical fact. During the Victorian era, Mourning jewelry containing a loved one's hair was commonplace, especially among women. It was a socially accepted way to carry grief publicly. But for many women, it was also their only voice, their only symbol of resistance to erasure. In a culture where silence was virtue, grief became a rebellion. Suddenly, you're not alone. Around the edge of the chamber, shadows shift. Figures emerge, not solid, not transparent suggested, like sketches left half-finished. All women, all watching you, their mouths do not move, but their message is clear. We remember, you turn, and the locket glows faintly in your palm. Then dims, you place it back. The figures step backward into the gloom. One by one, only one remains. She steps forward. Her face isn't visible, only her outline. But you know her. You've seen her in the mirror. She raises a hand, points upward, and vanishes. A stone door behind the pedestal grinds open, and beyond it daylight, fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe Victorian ghost stories weren't just about fear, they were encoded messages. Covert expressions of feminine resistance, mental illness, trauma, or even sexual repression. Women who could not speak directly of their reality encoded it through haunted metaphors. Whispered terror was often the only safe way to scream, you. Step through the door and emerge into a familiar garden. Your shoes crunch gravel. You're in the backyard of the house, but everything's shifted. The air is softer. The ivy is older. The windows no longer glare down on you like eyes. The house seems to exhale, its centuries-long sigh fading into summer silence. You turn back to look. The upper windows flicker. A curtain flutters without wind and then calm. Historians still argue whether the mass popularity of Victorian ghost literature was fueled by genuine supernatural belief, or a more subtle, collective effort to grieve en masse in a repressive era. But one thing's certain, the stories survived, even when the women who told them did not. You walked through the garden path, and the gate swings open for you. Outside, the street is quiet. Just past the lamppost, a child skips rope, singing an old rhyme. Cross the veil, don't look back, step. Through whisper, shadow, crack. If you hear your name at night, don't answer. Not unless it's right. She stops when she sees you. Did you find the letters? She asks. You nod slowly. Good, she says, resuming her song. Otherwise, they get stuck. They hum in the walls, waiting. You have to write them down. You walk past her, heartbeat steady now, and for the first time in what feels like hours, maybe centuries, you feel lighter, as if something unhooked from your shoulders, something you were never meant to carry, something that wasn't even yours. You pause, glance back one last time at the house. It doesn't beckon, it just stands, still listening. You walk now with a strange calm, like you've left some essential part of yourself behind in the earth, but not in a frightening way, more like shedding an old, damp coat after a storm. Your feet crunch along the lane, past low stone fences and hedges gone wild, until you reach the old inn at the crossroads. You've seen it before in faded postcards and brittle scrapbooks. The sign above the door swings gently, the widow's bell. You push the door open. Inside, it's hushed. Lamplight flickers across polished wood, worn chairs, and wallpaper that peels like dried petals. No bartender, no guests. Only a logbook open at the counter and a single glass of still water on the bar. You sign your name without thinking. That's when the bells begin, soft at first, like a distant funeral toll, then louder, rhythmic, unmistakably calling. You follow the sound up narrow stairs, your shadow long against the wall. Each step creaks like an exhale. You pass rooms with closed doors. One swings open slightly as you pass, and inside, a sewing machine hums by itself. A dress half finished lies draped over a chair. Beside it, a photograph of a woman with her eyes scratched out. You don't stop. Mainstream. Historical fact. Throughout Victorian England, women suffering from mental illness or simply inconvenient women were often quietly institutionalized, sometimes for years, sometimes for life. Their disappearances were explained away as travel, illness, or sudden religious devotion. Their names faded from family trees. Entire wings of asylums were filled with women whose only crime was wanting more. At the end of the hall is a door with no handle, but the bells are louder now, urgent and deep. You push. Inside, a chamber washed in deep blue and gold. Stained glass. Windows throw strange angles of light across the carpet. In the center of the room sits a writing desk, and behind it, a girl, no older than 50, writing, furiously by candlelight. You know she can't see you, but you step closer. She's copying from a journal in her lap. Her hand trembles slightly, but she doesn't stop. She's copying words you recognize because they're yours, because they will be yours. This is where it began. This is the first ghost story, not in a graveyard, not in a haunted manor. Here, with a girl alone, scribbling her truth into fiction because truth would have gotten her locked away. Here, in ink and metaphor, she breathes out the things she's not allowed to say. You watch her dip the pen again. It scratches. She writes of cold corridors and doors that lock from the outside. She writes of a husband who won't look her in the eye. She writes of a baby buried without a name. And she writes of something at the foot of her bed. Every night, watching. You blink and the candle goes out. When your eyes adjust, the girl is gone. Only the writing desk remains, and one fresh page on top fringe tidbit. In 1846, a young woman named Sarah Trembleton was admitted to St. Luke's Asylum for chronic melancholy and literary mania. She was later found to have written over 300 ghost stories during her confinement, all unpublished. Her surviving work was discovered only in 1972 in the asylum's attic. Many modern writers now trace tropes of Gothic feminism directly to her style. You sit in the girl's chair, and the pen is warm in your hand. The bells fade. Historians still argue whether Victorian ghost stories should be viewed as passive entertainment, or as coded resistance to the patriarchal systems of their time. But when you sit at this desk, you feel the urgency in those words. You understand that writing wasn't a game, it was survival, a message, a memory forced to wear a mask. You begin to write, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. You write the story of the house, the story of the stair that skipped a number, the woman in the red window, the lock of hair in the locket. You write it all, and the room listens. By the time the ink runs dry, you're shaking, but not from fear, from recognition, from truth, finally, spoken aloud. You rise, the door opens of its own accord. This time there's no hallway, just open air, evening sky, and the soft hush of grass beneath your feet. You step into it. No ghosts follow, no whispers call, only the gentle certainty that their story, your story, has finally been told. You walk home. You walk the final stretch through fields that sway in twilight, the wind warm against your face. There's a hush, now one not of absence, but of fullness. Like the story has filled every crack of your awareness, and only now, at the edge of it, can you truly breathe. You're not sure how long you've been walking, or whether your shoes even touch the earth anymore. But you're not lost. You never were. Ahead, a small stone chapel, crumbling a little at the corners, ivy climbing up its flanks like it's been trying to keep something inside. And beside it, a graveyard with crooked headstones leaning toward each other like gossiping old friends. You step through the gate. Inside the chapel, dust swirls through fading shafts of light. There's no pulpit, just rows of wooden pews and a faded mural of a woman with hollow eyes, her hands outstretched as if offering something you're not quite ready to accept. You take a seat and wait. The air grows heavy, not menacing, just dense, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. And then the whispers return, not words, more like breaths drawn through memory. One voice rises louder than the others. You recognize her immediately, not by her face, not even by her name, but by the shape of her grief. It's Eleanor again. Remember her, the governess whose story bled from diary to dream. She speaks now, not in warning, but in thanks. Her tale, long buried beneath Victorian respectability, has found ears willing to hear it. You smile, just a little. Mainstream historical fact. The late 19th century saw a sharp rise in the publication of supernatural fiction authored by women. Writers like Charlotte Riddell, Edith Nesbit, and Vernon often, writing under male pseudonyms, used ghost stories to subtly critique marriage, inheritance laws, and the institutional control of female bodies and minds. Their fiction was considered harmless entertainment until it wasn't. The whispers swell again, and more voices step forward. The maid who saw her reflection blink back, the girl in the attic who spoke in rhyme, the widow whose mirror cracked. At midnight, each one stepping out from under the smothering quilt of silence. Victorian society sewed so carefully. Fringe tidbit in 1882. The Society for Psychical Research was founded in Cambridge, tasked with investigating paranormal phenomena. Over 30% of its initial case submissions came from middle and upper-class women, many of whom reported being visited by ghosts with unfinished sentences. Psychologists today believe this was often a coded way to express trauma or injustice. In a socially acceptable format, the light in the chapel shifts, and the mural woman. Her hands are no longer empty. In her palms rests a single object, a writing quill, worn smooth from use, ink-stained, familiar. You reach for it, it disappears, because it's already in your hand. This was never just a story about ghosts. It was about what haunted the people who couldn't speak, what they left behind so that someone, anyone, might listen. Historians still argue whether the rise of Victorian ghost stories reflected genuine belief in the supernatural or was simply a narrative device to explore repressed desires, fears, and injustice. But in the hush of this chapel, you understand it doesn't really matter. The power was never in the apparition. It was in the telling, in the ink, in the inheritance of rage disguised as rumor, and grief disguised as Gothic. You walk back down the aisle, footsteps quiet now, not because you're afraid, but because something sacred has just taken place. Outside, the graveyard has changed. Each headstone bears the name of a woman you met tonight, each marked not only with date of death, but the year their story was finally heard, and one of them far in the corner, slightly tilted, has your name carved into the stone. Not an omen, just a promise that your story, too, will be told. You turn toward the lane behind you, the chapel. Bells ring once, then silence. You walk away, no need to look back, because tonight's ghosts have been freed. You slow your breath now, letting the images drift like fog across a field. The chapel fades, the page turns, and your footsteps return to the softness of your own floor. Maybe your bedroom carpet, maybe your sheets. The echoes of the story settle around you like an old shawl, tattered but warm. You realize that the ghosts never wanted to frighten you, they just wanted to be remembered. You think about the ink on Eleanor's hands, the murmur of that sewing machine in the empty room, the girl in the writing chair crafting survival into sentences. How all of them passed something down to you, not through blood, but through story. And now, it's yours. You breathe in deeply, the kind of breath that makes your chest ache in the best way. You might still hear a whisper or two tonight goes from the veil you walked through. But they'll be gentle now, thankful, soft, like a friend, who doesn't want to wake you but just wanted to say, I made it, I was real, thank you. So you let your eyes close, let your shoulders sink, let the hush roll over you like waves on the sand. Tomorrow, the world will be noisy again, but for now, it's just you, and the stories you carry. Good night.